Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership Podcast. I have a good friend of a friend called Nandu. Now, Nandu, welcome. Nandu is a good mate of a friend of mine, Barnaby Davis, someone I've worked with at Barclays many years ago, and Nandu worked with him. Barnaby said this man is exceptional, and I actually agree with him, having had a couple of conversations now with him. And welcome, Nandu. Great to have you on the podcast.
It's a pleasure and honor. Thank you, Jonathan.
So let's firstly get you to talk about what you're doing now and how you help leaders and teams. Tell us a little bit about what you do now, some of the quirky and unusual things, because they are.
So I run a small boutique leadership consulting business where I work with C-suite and senior leaders from the likes of Amazon to Qatar Airways to Microsoft to Nokia to help them collectively identify their blind spots.
I like that. Yeah. And because I think it's very hard to develop teams these days. Everybody's so busy. I was talking to a military leader the other day, a Navy SEAL, about, I said, how much do you reckon they spend on your development in the Navy SEALs? He said, we were probably counting about $3 or $4 million on my development. And I go, in business? If they spend £3,000 or £4,000 on you, they think it's a lot. And they go, "Oh, that's a lot of money," you know. And I remember saying to someone, "This is the cost of running an offsite for you with your team," and they went, "That's a lot of money." I said, "Yeah, and if you think education's expensive, try the cost of ignorance, because all too often we don't train, we don't develop." As one of the leaders said to me the other day, 85% of the success of a business really relies on the quality of the leaders and the people you have.
Yep.
Are you spending that amount of money on developing those people so they can blossom and flourish? And you do something a little bit different with them. And
Jonathan, what's interesting is, the moment you become a senior leader, you get a coach, right? Now, we're all human beings. The typical reaction is, we are the nice people, or I'm the nice person. My peers are not so very nice. I'm the superhero trying to rescue the organization. Now, if the coach is good, they can probe and get a little deeper. But that does not solve the problem because, as you know, teams win and teams don't win. So what I do is I collectively get the team together and say, let's talk about it together. And I have a technique to go really deep to understand those blind spots. And then how do we kind of solve and address some of those issues?
Yeah. And it's interesting, the couple of things that come from that. One is that often the ego gets in the way. And you say people are given a coach. Sometimes they're not given a coach. Sometimes they're promoted to become a CEO or a C-suite executive, and there is no coach. Sometimes because they don't want one, they go, "There's nothing wrong with me. I don't need a coach. What are you making out that I'm not good enough?" Or the chairman goes, "I think the CEO needs a coach." And just a couple of blind spots they might spot. But they go, tennis champions, do they have a coach? Yeah, they have actually two coaches often, and they're constantly working with their coach because even if they're Wimbledon champion, they want to be better and they want to be practicing, getting better and better. And again, thinking of the sort of military analogies, train hard, fight easy, that you, in your practice, in your preparation for something, you really train hard, you put yourself through, a bit like training in the gym to get fitter for something, a big event you might be doing or a triathlon or something like that. You've got to put in the training, but people don't want to do that. They want to be instantly perfect. And the problem's out there, them, the others, often the peers. And if I look back on my own career, I think I was far too competitive with my peers, thinking that, there's only one person who could be the commanding officer of the regiment or the CEO. And it was me versus them. There's a really naive and a really short-sighted view. Whereas actually, if I realized that my first team was everybody around me working for the CEO and that we should share resources and best practice with each other, and it would be safe enough to be vulnerable. But it's often not safe, is it? You were saying, what we discussed, it's not safe in a team.
Now, you can't blame the leaders, right? So a current leader, gone are the days where you have seamless amount of money. So even some of the organizations that I named before, budgets are coming down. You have to do more with less. You have multiple wheels spinning, and then you have big fat egos. Then you have the politician syndrome. Hey, I'm the new CEO. The previous mess, I've got nothing to do with it. So what you realize, and Satya Nadella puts this in a beautiful way, he says a leader is a good problem solver. They wouldn't have become one if they weren't. A senior leader is an excellent problem solver, but the only problem is most people don't know what the problem to solve. And on top of that, you have very poor trust as well. So what I do is let's address all of that in an experiential and immersive way. So the big question is, why on earth should they work with a Nandu? So typically what I do is the first hour is really focused on gamification, experiential, immersive stuff they've never ever done before. I'll get into with detail a little later on. But that really opens up, and then I go really deep into what's going well. Everyone loves to talk about what's going well, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
But then the quick question is, why is it going well? Is it the organizational ethos? Is it organizational values? Is it the CEO, HR? And then you go into what's not going well.
I think that's really interesting. And why don't we talk about, I think you talked about one of the immersive experiences where people were wearing these weighted suits. Do you want to just say a bit about that one? That sounded like a lot of fun.
There's a big story, right? So I was working for a leading bank, and I wrote a white paper for disabled customers. So the rationale being 80 billion in liquid assets, right? A very profitable segment. Secondly, banking is vanilla. So to do something different is bloody hard. And the third thing, forget everything else. It's the right thing to do for people who really need the help. So I wrote this white paper, didn't get too far, and it was very frustrating. I couldn't believe people just didn't think it was important enough. I then changed roles and I ended up working for a lady called Elizabeth Oster. And she said, Nandu, you've got to think differently to get people's attention. So what I did was I locked 50 of the senior most leaders in that organization, gave them tunnel vision glasses, dexterity gloves, 25-kilo dexterity suits, and asked them to sit on some extremely comfortable sofas and said, would you mind getting up? In 6 months' time, the chairman of that bank said, we want to be the most inclusive organization in the UK.
Wow. It was by, if I just play that back, by having these, I don't know what a dexterity suit is and glasses, but I imagine it's making everything feel like a different experience, and they couldn't get out of the sofas. Is that right?
Yeah, so it limits every single muscle of your body. It limits what you can see and it limits what you can hear. And we gave them some very thin pens and said, could you just write and get up? And so a series of things where you read constantly, you have people in your society as well. But unless you experience it yourself, it's very, very hard.
Yeah, no, time and again. I mean, isn't that a lesson for us all that we, I call it CCG. We criticize, we complain, and we gossip. It's always about other people. It's always, we'd be fine if it wasn't for the other idiots in the organization or people out there. The world would be fine. And we're very quick to judge other people. But until it was, very interesting for me. Lee and I are going back to Nepal, where the charity she founded as CEO, which is the Inspiring Leadership Foundation, it's helping the victims of violence against women and girls. And in Nepal, it's the trafficking of the young women into India to be put into the sex trade and abused. And so this means a lot to us. We're working with my friend Himalaya Thapa and his wife. And he and I were at Sandhurst together. But the reason I mentioned this is it's really only when you go out to Nepal, and we were on trek, and we woke up one morning, it was a group of us, we were trekking, and outside my tent was a queue of 30 people. And I go, hello, how can I help? And one of my friends spoke Nepalese, and he said, you're the doctor to them. I said, but I'm only just the medic for the team. I mean, I've had a day's training. Yeah. And they said, but this man's walked 10 miles to come and see you. He's got this gaping sore on his leg. And you realize just how a different world you're in. Now, I was able to help a little bit, but you just realize that in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I think seeing it from another person's perspective, it's something I relearn every day, that I made a judgment. I made an assumption. Don't you think assumptions are the mother of all disasters?
Well,
yeah, we really make some big assumptions. Going from that fascinating work that you do, you've met lots of good leaders. You met some awful leaders. We all have our fair share. But if you were to call out a couple of really interesting leaders, you've mentioned to me before, but I'd like you to tell us about them. Why do you find these two people, it's a man and a woman, CEOs, why are they inspiring leaders? What is it you admire and respect about them? And why would you like them to be guests on the show?
Okay. Let me talk about two people. One is Susanna Rexy. She's the CEO of Standing on Giants. And the next person is Sumit Dar, who's the CEO of Oryx Labs. So, Standing on Giants, the founders created GiveGab, possibly the world's first community driven mobile network. And they go on to run communities now for companies like Airbnb, Tesco, and Lenovo. And Sumit runs a really cutting edge cybersecurity end to end solution provider working with the governments and some very interesting organizations based out in the Middle East. Now, Susanna was my colleague, and I hired Sumit to work in my team many, many years back. But I completely admire the way they've transformed to be phenomenal leaders. And three things common about them is they have a very coaching style of leadership. Number two is they are great listeners. And the final one is truly authentic style of leadership. So I think they'll be great to come on board.
Well, you've touched on a number of fascinating qualities, attributes, characteristics of inspiring leaders. Why do these people make a difference to the lives of people who work for them and the lives of many people who they'll never meet? And the skill of listening, we forget time and again. We're so busy transmitting that we're not receiving. And often in your exercise, I'm sure you run this one, whether it's the talking pen or whoever has that can speak, but they only can speak if they summarized to the satisfaction with a thumbs up of the person who spoke before what they were saying, catching the essence of it. And all too often we're so busy transmitting that we're learning nothing new, because as soon as we open our own mouth, we're just repeating what we already know. But if we really, really listen, I think it's a great skill. Two people who made a huge impact on my life in a very short space of time. One was receiving my MBE from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and the other one was meeting Princess Diana. Both of them had this incredible ability to really listen to you in a way that you felt seen and heard like no one had ever seen or heard you before. And I think it's a great quality for men and women to learn, whatever your role is, to really see and hear people who've not been seen and heard before. Yeah. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely right. In fact, I have a story. I started my career as a data analyst. So 20 odd years back, if you ask me the question, Jonathan, what is a good piece of analysis? I would say a good piece of analysis is something which should be insightful. Now, why would you do the piece of analysis if everyone knew that fact? 5 years later on, I changed my mind. I asked that question again, what is a good piece of analysis? I said, it's got to be insightful, but if it's not actionable, it's waste of everyone's time. 5 years later on, I changed my mind again, Jonathan. So I figured out it's got to be insightful, it's got to be actionable, but if it's not influential enough, the number of times you have the most compelling idea that you can't either convince the board or your senior management to do something about it, or even your team. And I talk about being influential is a combination of a few things. One is, you've got to be backed by data, obviously. You've got to be inspirational. You've got to be experiential, but you've got to understand the pulse of your audience. And how do you understand the pulse of your audience? Is you've got to bloody goddamn listen, which a lot of people don't do. So completely agree. What an amazing Jonathan.
Yeah, insightful, actionable, influential, experiential, and particularly the listening. Well, you're a wonderful storyteller. So the story of your life, and I also want you to mix in there the story of how you've learned to become resilient. Who shaped your life? What happened to you? I thought it was a fascinating journey that you've been on. Tell us a bit about it. Growing up without a television over in India, and how you've ended up doing what you're doing now. So take us on the journey.
So let me start off, by the way. So India today, 25 years later on, possibly in terms of technology, is actually leaps ahead of possibly the UK and US in terms of things available. But I grew up in the southern part of India called Kerala. And during my early childhood years, so we didn't have a landline phone, we didn't have access to a TV. In fact, a lot of people find it amusing. We would listen to a movie on the radio, right? So it was fascinating. And what's interesting is the first time I jumped on a plane was when I was 24 in 2004, and the journey to come to Liverpool. So you see the painting behind me, Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
It's gifted by a good friend of mine, Jill Griffiths, from Liverpool. In fact, Liverpool's got some of the friendliest people in the world, I think. But I had a problem. All my life, I thought I could speak English. And I landed in Liverpool. My first journey, as you could have figured out, I've never been on a plane, so I've not very widely traveled. And I couldn't understand the Scousers. And no one could understand me. I was literally in tears. But anyway, fast forward, and I was doing my MBA at University of Liverpool. I settled in well. I was doing, really well in my academics, the modules I was topping. I was actually doing some consulting work for the Roy Castle Lung Cancer Foundation, one of the leading charity lung cancer foundations in the world. I was doing an internship with the Royal and Sun Alliance. I was part of the University Student Senate. I was playing badminton for the university team. Everything was going perfect, right? So finished the exams, wrote the thesis, the dissertation. The results would come, and then 2 weeks graduation. So I invited my friends and family, ordered the gown. A small problem. I failed my thesis.
Wow. You failed your thesis.
I failed my thesis. And, I'd taken a student loan to come to Liverpool.
Yeah.
I had a job back in India, which was offered with the assumption that I'd complete my MBA. What do I tell my friends and family who'd booked their tickets to come along? The sad reality, Jonathan, was the graduation happened for all my friends. I was the guy taking photographs in t-shirt and jeans, everyone in their gowns and hat. It couldn't get worse. From a student life perspective, I couldn't contemplate that point in time. What worse could happen in my life? But what's fascinating, so I had to go and extend my visa, right? Because I was going to go back to India. So the lady at the Home Office, a very sweet lady, she said, Nandu, what happens if you fail again? So instead of the 3 months visa, I'm going to give you 1 year visa, which I thought was weird at that point in time. But anyway, I had asked for my piece of work to be reviewed again. The university put their hand up and said, we've actually made a mistake.
Wow.
They corrected my marks. I passed the dissertation. I completed my MBA, and I had a 1 year visa. So a great friend of mine who was my boss then, James Baldwin, he said, hey, Nandu, we love what you do. Here's a compelling offer. Do you want to come along and work for us? So what was fascinating is from what I thought was the worst thing to happen, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Now, Jonathan, the story doesn't finish.
No, but just stay with that one. I think it is very interesting. So coming to Liverpool to do your MBA, they'd made a mistake, but you didn't know it. And you had to swallow your pride with everybody you knew that you'd failed. You couldn't go back to this job in India. You'd luckily been given the extension of the visa by 12 months. And then something else happened. And I time and again remind people, and myself, I think, when a door closes, another window opens. Or, I was thinking about both two of our three daughters are at the moment trying to move house, and they thought they'd got it and that fell through, or the person had lied to them and they hadn't got any regulations for the building extension they did and it wasn't covered. They hadn't told them, and the estate agent knew it but didn't mention it. And so it was going to be, a problem. But I always said a bit of advice that my Irish mother-in-law said to me, and that's what's meant for you won't pass you by. And if it does pass you by, it was not meant for you. Mm-hmm. But in this particular case, what was not meant for you was going back to that particular job in India because another door opened because of something. So it's like in everything, what's the learning in this? And the Navy SEALs go, okay, shit happens. This problem has happened. Now what? And I think you've taken that lesson from that tough time. But carry on with the story, because there's more to come.
Yeah, the story is fascinating. So what happened then is I moved down to a place called Horsham, which is down south of London, where the Royal and Sun Alliance had its head office. So 10 months into the job, James comes along and tells me again, saying, Nandu, you're doing a phenomenally good job. Hey, we don't actually hire people who are overseas citizens, but we love you so much that we're going to hire, I think, Ernst & Young as a consulting company to come on board to get your work permit sorted. I was like, oh my God, I threw a big party, picked up a lovely place to stay in Horsham. They applied for the work permit. And in 2 months' time, I get a letter. The letter says, we're very sorry, extremely sorry. We've rejected your work permit application. And guess what? You have to leave the country in 48 hours.
Oh.
I was like, oh my God, life was set, friends, family, house, things. But anyway, what happened was I had to leave. You don't mess with the home office, do you? Right? So packed my bags. My friends came and helped me. On my way to London Heathrow, I dropped into the office just to say goodbye. There was a lady, Pat Fielding. She said, hey, Nandu, just so you know, we've outsourced a lot of work to Accenture. And there are a few thousand people working out of Bangalore and Mumbai. Go and have a conversation with a lady called Fiona, who is an expat from the UK. So I go to India, have a chat with her, and she says, hey, by the way, I've heard so much about you. I was looking for an interim chief of staff. Would you want to pick it up? I couldn't believe I was getting paid in pounds in India. I had a chauffeur-driven car, and I was put up in a five-star hotel. Exciting work. My sister had just given birth to the second child in Bangalore, so I get to meet family over the weekends. And then guess what happens? In 2 months' time, James calls me back and says, guess what? Your work permit application is sorted. Do you want to come back? And I had to do the most weirdest of all requests. James, I'm having such an amazing time. Can I stay back for one more month? So what's fascinating, and I truly believe, Jonathan, to your question is, if you don't quit, you have to win.
If you don't quit, you have to win. But look, you've made me think of something else. This idea of when things happen and what you have to say sometimes to people. I transferred from one regiment. It's called the Royal Signals. It was communications, and I joined after I'd been an instructor at Santos to the Green Howards, now the Yorkshire Regiment. And while I was there, I was very early on made an acting major, so a bit like you, and paid extra money to command a company. And it was a really fantastic job. Screen company, air mobile. We had the SAS's light strike vehicles. We had dune buggies. It was just a boy's dream. I was even interviewed by TV. A TV journalist was filming us driving around in our vehicles and this kind of stuff and flying in the helicopters. It was great fun. And then the head of the British Army, the late Field Marshal Lord Inge, was looking for an aide de camp, an ADC, to travel with him when he was head of the army. And so they lined up some people from his regiment. There was about 4 of us. And anyway, he met us all and this kind of stuff. And at the end, he selected me, and I came in. He said, right, Darwin, I want you to start. I said, well, sir, I'm really honored. I'd love to be your ADC. It's just I'm having such a good time, having only just joined the regiment 6 months ago. Is there any way I could just sort of stay on, miss this turn, but stay on and in a year's time be your ADC, if you choose somebody else? He said, go away and think about it. Right, so, because people don't say no to him. He was quite a ferocious individual. So I went away and I thought about it, and I came back. I said, I have thought about it. So I said, good, I knew you would. I said, the answer's still the same, sir. I still would like to stay, but if you wouldn't mind and wanted another one in a year's time, I'd be honored. Oh, just get out. So I left, and he chose someone else, a nice friend of mine. But he fired him after about 9 months. He fired him. It was really unfair. He has a habit of getting through them. He'd fired the one before that as well. So your life expectancy was worse than a World War I officer. And I get this phone call, and he goes, that's 9 months later. He goes, are you ready now? I go, sir, I would be honored. I've had a good time. It's a bit like you as chief of staff having another month. I had a bit longer, but actually it was the toughest job I ever did. he would have fired me too.
I was going to ask you that. How long did you survive?
Yeah, I did survive the year. I made the year. The only reason I think I survived the year, because there's another story all about making a few blunders. I made a few blunders. I wasn't made to be an aide de camp. I'm not very good as someone's assistant. My dyslexia and attention to detail, not particularly good. But I found out later that he probably would have fired me. But the postings branch, the guys who put people into positions, they went, Peter, look, you've got through 2 already in about 18 months. If you fire another one, like, it's going to look as if it's you, not them. Oh, okay. So I think I scraped by just by numbers rather than by any competence. But anyway, back to you. What did you learn about resilience in all the things that happened to you in that journey coming over here? And particularly, I mean, this is a story of a talented immigrant coming to the UK and how badly we treat you with giving you 48 hours to leave. It wasn't a particularly good experience, but you remain ever cheerful.
I've got to be careful what I talk about the Home Office, but my visa was coming to an end, and that's the reason they asked me to leave. Unfortunate, but I guess the key thing is sometimes it's so difficult to be optimistic. It's so difficult to see light at the end of the tunnel. But if you persist, if you genuinely persist and slightly think outside the box, good things will happen.
Yeah. And you also talked about pivotal moments, things that have gone on. Is there anything you'd share about pivotal moments in the other part of your life?
So I think I'd go back to that example of that tunnel vision glasses, right? That finally changed my mind about how can you engage people. Leaders today, they're so busy, they're so distracted. You go and present in an executive committee, everyone's busy on their mobiles, they're doing 10 other things. The key moment is that Elizabeth Oster, who told me, Nandu, you've got to get people's attention, and you've got to get people's attention when people are incredibly busy. So doing something beautiful, being articulate and talking sense, unfortunately today is not enough. And things are getting worse because now you got, leaders running organizations in their 20s talk about their attention span.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think I love the point when we were talking earlier about discovering blind spots and this power of experiential learning. And there is, in any kind of learning, when people practice it, they go, yeah, now I get it. I mean, I'm an early adopter. I think it sounds like you are. And if I find that I see something I might have read, being dyslexic, I listen to about 2 audiobooks a week. So that's well over 100 audiobooks a year. If only as I was growing up, if only they'd had audiobooks then, I would have had quite a different life, because all leaders are readers, but not all readers are leaders. And when I say a reader, I mean you could be reading an audiobook or listening to an audiobook.
Jonathan, let me give you a funny story, right? So when I talked about the first hour being experiential, I go the extremes of doing hardcore immersive technology-based stuff to something very basic. So I'm going to take a minute and give you an example of something that I do. So I take an A5 piece of paper, I did with this particular organization, had a photograph and a small write-up about the customer. So I asked these leaders in groups of 4 saying, do you want to spend about 5-10 minutes talking about the journey of this customer, their interaction with the brand, and tell me on a score of 1 to 10 how well you know the customer, 10 being, I know them really well. So typical men, they put their feet on the table, they say, oh, I know this guy really well, I go on a stag do, 9.5 on 10. And then I tell them, by the way, great, this was just on a random image I downloaded out of Google. What you got to do in the next 35 minutes, go down to one of those 2 local pubs, find this customer, and have exactly the same conversation that you had. Jonathan, I've got a question for you. 5 out of 10 times, despite having an image and a write-up, they fail to spot the customer. Can you guess why?
Well, I've got 2 thoughts. I mean, the first one was just a question back to you before I answer that one. Were they all men, or were the women better and less arrogant than the men?
I would say yes.
Yeah, the women normally are. I mean, typical one, just coming up before I answer your question, time and again, friends of mine in executive search find that they've got the right woman for the job, but she goes, no, I've only got about 90% of the skills. I'm really going to have to wait until I've got 110 and then I'll go for the job. And so they often will pull out from a job when they're really good for it. The men, they go, oh, I can do 50% of that, but yeah, I can bring it on. I'll learn as I go along. And it is a real arrogance in some of the men. But I wonder if the reason that they couldn't find the people in these pubs, even though they had a photograph and they had a write-up, was might it be that the people who they were going to meet were pretty anxious about who they were going to meet, so they were on best behavior and trying to dress up differently, looking better? What do you reckon?
You steal my thunder, Jonathan. I'm disappointed. Yes, spot on. Because what happens is, so for instance, I picked up a butcher. The photograph was, while he was working, and then he figures out I have a chance to meet this person that I see on BBC. He comes up in a suit, full, well shaved, and obviously, don't get me wrong, they're under significant time pressure, but they just walk up and down because they're busy looking for someone else. So it's amazing, with even all the information that we provided, how we fail to see the most obvious thing.
Yeah. No, it's a good lesson for us. We are, and particularly men, they can go to the fridge and they go, darling, it's not here. No, it's in the fridge. No, I've looked. And they've done a man look, which is like on that shelf. The fact that it's on the shelf below, or the keys are behind something, I've looked and it's not there. It's a man. We call it a man look.
I'm terrible. My wife gets so annoyed. It's the most obvious thing.
Yeah, it's a particular thing. But you have a real drive about trying to make a difference in the world. And you've already been involved in 2 startups. Tell us a bit about that.
So the first one was, I was a data analyst, and my friend and colleague, John Conway, who was a fellow data analyst, we were sitting late in the office one day and we're wondering, in the name of philanthropy, we get senior leaders to go and paint a school or clean a canal. Now, I understand the sentiment behind it, but these are individuals who are paid a few £1,000s a day going to paint a school, which they do a mediocre job, which I can get someone else to do for £100 a day. So the question was, how can we get people to do exactly what they do in their corporate space in the charity ecosystem? Now, obviously, it's very common, known as skills-based volunteering. So John and I, we reached out to a good friend of ours, Matt Boyle, who was then the director of the Roy Castle Lung Cancer Foundation, to say, hey, we've got this idea. Do you think with all the expertise that we do, can we do something at your place? And they said, hey, by the way, we're struggling with fundraising. So we looked at the entire campaign history for the last 5 to 10 years. We came up with some proposals. We applied, at that point in time, propensity modeling to target customers. And in 3 months, we realized we've literally improved their fundraising efficiency by 120%.
You are amazing and well done. And this is my mission for you. My wife's charity, the Inspiring Leadership Foundation, needs someone who will use their skills to help us fundraise, because it's been going for 8 years. It's doing a great job for the victims of violence against women and girls. We just need to do some fundraising to really change the lives of thousands of young women. So that's your mission after this.
You got my email and you got my phone number.
Yeah. I'm on your case. Hey, look, that's great. So,
to continue, Jonathan. So what eventually happened, though, is we ended up doing this work for over 10 years with 800 volunteers in partnership with Google, University of Cambridge, and Barclays, working with over 100 charities, solving societal challenges all the way from fundraising to operational effectiveness to clinical research.
Wow. That's really good. You must feel very good about that, eh? Because it's the lives that you've touched. And it's interesting. I don't know whether I pronounced it correct. Kerala, where you came from. I always remember seeing pictures of Kerala being like the dream destination with the sort of palm trees and sandy beaches. Is it still like that?
It's the third most visited place in India. It's beautiful. It's got lovely beaches. It's famous for its Ayurvedic massages.
Yes.
And what people don't realize, there's no poverty in Kerala. And for the last 25, 30 years, it's 100% literacy. It's very, very different. And people are incredibly friendly.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll have to talk to you about one day. We've got to go and visit there. Think back to when you were 16 to 18 years old. Back to the Future in your DeLorean, and you go and meet the young Nandu there, what advice would you give to yourself about this really is important and that doesn't matter? What would you say to a bit of advice you'd give to yourself if you went back and met yourself?
So I would always say pick up roles. They always talk about the we, right? The we standing for what you like versus what you're good at. And the closer that you bring in life, because we're all tempted to pick up things which are incredibly attractive and forget the other part in terms of what skill sets do I actually have to do that job. So one advice I give to people is that self introspection to say, how do you bring it closer? And then the answer is obvious.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really good bit of advice to give to your younger self. And what would you tell your younger self? Don't worry so much about this. It really doesn't matter. You're getting very excited about that, but that really isn't important. I can tell you now, having grown up a lot and been through all the experiences I have, what doesn't matter?
Don't worry about money and don't worry
Yeah.
about grades. When you work in a typical corporate organization, you're so obsessed about the job title and the grade. There's a joke, banking is notorious for having very generous job titles. When I became a vice president, my dad actually thought, oh my God, he's done so well. And then when he became a director, he thought I sat in the board of directors of the organization. But the problem is people who work in the corporate world get so obsessed about it. The question you've got to ask yourself, do I want to be the CEO of an organization which has an HR freeze, an IT freeze, and you've got to keep the bulb on? Or do you want to be in a place where there's significant growth? Now, the question only you can answer. Some people enjoy one and some people don't enjoy that part. So the question is don't follow money, money will come, and don't be obsessed about grades.
Mm-hmm. I think that's two wise bits of advice back to your younger self. And I would also say, on the topic of grades and ranks and positions, that leadership is a choice you make to be a leader. It's not a rank or a grade. People go, oh, he's this grade, so he's a leader. No, I can tell you, I've met lots of people at that grade, and they wouldn't recognize leadership if they fell into it. And they're perhaps heavily into management or micromanagement or criticism, but they don't understand that there's an element of personal example, of humility, of humanity, of, as you say, listening, personal skills that is required to earn the respect. It's not popularity. People go for popularity, but to earn the respect of the people you lead, that you will do the right things rather than just doing things right. What do you think?
I completely agree. Completely agree. Now, the problem is at any given point of time, back to my early example, it is very difficult to see the obvious. But people who persist with their values over a long period of time are the clear winners. And people who compromise and take shortcuts, success, at a different time scale may look very attractive, but they've all burned their fingers.
Yeah, and you and I were talking when we were planning this call about the importance of integrity under pressure, and just how important trust and trustworthiness is, and that people know that you are reliable, and that they know that you're in it for the right reason for the organization rather than just for yourself. What would you say about lessons you've personally learned about integrity under pressure?
So look at this. I run a boutique leadership consulting business where revenues are very, very important, and you got to hit your numbers because you got people to pay for as well. So there's a particular instance. I was given an opportunity to work for a FTSE 100 company in the UK, and I pitched my work to the management committee, the C-suite, and they wanted me to do a piece of work. So they nominated an exco member, and I picked their team, and I did this piece of work on the blind spots, where I was looking at how they perceived senior leaders as well. So then I did the debrief a few weeks later on with this individual and went through quite a lot of feedback that they actually had about the management. And the response was, Nandu, oh my God, I can't believe this. I'm going to go and have a word with my team now. I couldn't believe what I just heard. So personally for me, it was a very lucrative client, almost a year's piece of work. And the question I had to ask myself was, do I really want to work with someone who, one, is not open for feedback, two, does not trust their team members, and is not ready to man up to honest feedback, which will help them become a better organization? And very painfully, I had to walk out.
Well done on that. And just playing that one back, the leader in this particular FTSE 100, they weren't, from what I understand from you, they weren't open to learning from the feedback because they thought themselves above that. They were faultless. Secondly, that they wanted to hunt down the guilty and find the people who'd criticized them and give them a hard time. Was that right?
Indeed. What ironic, Jonathan, is they thought they were truly open to feedback.
Yeah.
That's the biggest problem, right?
Yeah. And well, look, stay with us, because I do find, like you, that feedback with any leader, normally when I work with the CEO and his team or her team, early on, I want to do 360 feedback. We have a tool ourselves around inspiring leadership, and they rate themselves, and then they get 20 other people to rate them.
Yeah.
And I also do a second version that gets one view, but with about 8 to 10 of the people, I talk to them in person. And that, in the conversations, you get a different insight that you wouldn't otherwise, and you write it up. And sometimes it really is quite hard hitting. But one or two of the leaders don't want others to know they're going through 360. I don't know why.
Wow.
And that's disappointing. They'd rather sort of keep a low profile. Perhaps it's because they don't want to think that, it's a tough time. I don't want them to think I'm spending a lot of money on me. Well, actually, if you improve, the whole organization improves. There's thousands, millions will come if you're leading well and making the right decisions. But the whole point of the 360 is really what they do with it. And the best leaders I've come across, the best CEO, this particular one I remember now, he goes, right, I'm going to take this 360 and I'm going to publish it for all the organization to see the 360 you've given me.
Impressive. That is so
impressive. The whole organization got to see it. Now, others perhaps want to share it with all their executive team. This is the feedback on me, and I've got work to do. I sometimes, for those who are a little bit, less vulnerable and open to, because only the strong can be vulnerable, so that they don't feel strong enough to be vulnerable. But I say, look, pick 3 of the things you're pleased to hear about, and 2 to 3 of the things that behaviors you want to work on, and share those. Share those with all the people who took, thank you for taking part in my feedback. Here is 3 of the things I was really pleased to hear from the 20 people. And because it must be unattributable, otherwise they'll literally, some of them will try and hunt down. I think that's so-and-so. No, stop right now. If you're going to be after that person, I am not going to like you, not going to work with you. But then these are the 2 behaviors. And every month I'll be checking in with you over the next year while I'm being coached. And I will check with you on a scale of 1 to 10, how am I doing on my listening this month? Like 1 is really, you're awful at listening, and 10 is world-class. And the fact they're then accountable to that group of people that you've had involved, and they're getting feedback from them, it's really powerful. And then the twist, this is a nice twist, is they go, and I'll be getting feedback from you, thank you for that, but would you be open to telling me which 2 areas you're working on by behavior? And I could give you feedback on a scale of 1 to 10 on how I see you doing, catching you doing it right, not catching you doing it wrong. I'm going to want to catch you doing it right. That behavior that you want to work on, I'll be pointing out when I see you do it and say, keep going. That's it. And I think a lot of people, particularly those who are brought up in audit or actuaries or accountants, they treat people like they treat their books. They can see the error in the code, almost back to your days doing your data analysis. They can see where the error is, and they treat humans like that. Here's the fault. I found this one blemish in you. There. Gotcha. And of course, that doesn't motivate anybody. What do you think?
Jonathan, in fact, I've got a question for you because this is a topic of deep interest. Talking about 360 degree, at any level, would you
Mhm.
keep the feedback anonymous or would you leave people's name on it?
I it's an interesting. I generally, as a rule, tell them it's all going to be unattributable. However, what I do say to them as if you would like to share this feedback with the CEO himself or herself, have a conversation with them, just one on one. Say, look, I was giving the feedback to Jonathan, but I think I'd feel more comfortable to actually tell you it as well in personal. The bit
Yeah,
of advice I gave you is that you do this really well. What would make you www? What worked well? This is what would make you even better
yeah,
is if you also did this. And that WWWEBI, don't know who I learned it from years ago, is a great technique. The other one, when I worked with Marshall Goldsmith, who's one of the world's top coaches, he's now in his, I think probably Marshall's about 80 now, but a fantastic character from Kentucky. And Marshall used a technique called GDD.
okay,
We used to in the military have an after action review when been on operation or something had been very difficult. We'd do an after action review, whether it was good or bad, we'd learn from it. And his technique in the equivalent of an after action review is GDD. What was good? What was difficult? And what would you do differently?
got it.
And that's very powerful, very powerful.
The reason why I asked you is because I was recently doing some work with senior directors and MDs of a particular bank. And this whole conversation about feedback came
Yeah.
in. And I asked them, typically, when would you ask for feedback? They said, hey, feedback is a very important part of our performance cycle. We would ask just before the end of year cycle finishes for our end of year review, and that has a huge component for our bonuses and financial incentives. I said, you've got to change the window, right? Is because a lot of people that you work with, honestly, may give you constructive feedback, but may not give you very cynical feedback, is because they know what they're going to give you is going to have an impact on your career and on your incentives. So I said, flip it around. Ask for feedback in January once the entire process is over, because then they genuinely know you're reaching out for feedback. The whole question about why, Simon Sinek's why are you asking for feedback, is because you want to make changes the way you operate as a leader.
Yeah. Uh, I've seen this, and you've spent all of your life in the banking world. I do less work in the banks now, more techs, bigger companies, a mix of different telecoms, a whole range of different organizations. I think sometimes the banks have got a little bit caught up with this process around the 360 leads to what incentives, what bonus you get. So, hey, how about we all collude, guys? I'll say nice things about you if you say nice things about me, and then we'll all get promoted and paid lots. So there's a bit of gamification of the system in the banks. It is particular. I've seen it in the banks, and no one really is honest anymore. They're
Yeah,
all they're all elevating, just like they do this the curve of
yeah,
performance. Who's a 1, who's a 10, and everybody is elevated. Everybody's perfect, but really, are they really? So I think there's a lack of honesty and integrity when when
true.
money is involved and bonuses are involved. And the other thing is a story which is when I think about banks, I remember one particular person. He said he was given a bonus of many thousands of pounds. And his boss came in at the end of the year and he put the check on his desk. He goes, there you are. And he walked out. It was a huge check, kind of thing I'd only dream of. And he said, you know what? He said he could have taken me out for lunch and just shared with me what he valued about me, areas he wanted to develop. Of course, money is lovely, and I'm paid a lot of money. They were paid lots of money anyway. So he said it was just he didn't really care. He just, there was a check. There's no like connection between him and me and how I could develop a bit more and how was the family and what are my children like. And it's the human connection that people want, don't they?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Let's talk about health. The health quotient is a big area. It's not something that you and I have talked about, so I'm bouncing you on this one. But what have you seen about how important mental health is and physical health? both for yourself and for the people you're with, but go for yourself first. What have you done? What's your routine to keep yourself fit and healthy? And how's it been when you were not fit and healthy? And how's it been when you are? And do you see it impacting your performance and your family?
It's an interesting question, right? So even though my job is constantly with people, because I moderate a lot of sessions, I facilitate, I get people to think outside the box, it sometimes is incredibly lonely, is because you wear a different hat while you're running these sessions. So one thing I started doing a couple of years back is I used to play a lot of badminton before that, but I started playing tennis. And tennis I play at least 3 times a week,
Mm.
I end up meeting some very interesting people and some great conversations. So both physical and mental health. COVID was a hard time. Being locked in and not being able to do that. It's just the most obvious thing. You've got to look after. And unfortunately, Jonathan, I'm turning 45 this year. So you've got to do it even more. Is because we're all busy in our lives and we just don't put enough effort to look after ourselves.
Mm.
And as the air hostess would say on a plane, put oxygen mask on you first, even before you've got a child. I've got a 6-year-old, but you've got to look after yourself.
Yeah, well, look, congratulations on your 6-year-old. I've got grandchildren of that age, and
Oh, congratulations.
because I'm 20 years on you. But even now, training 4 times a week in the gym, weight training, and then doing some runs, probably it'll top up to about 10 kilometers a week. It's really important for us. And then I find I've got the mental capacity to cope with whatever gets thrown at me. Hey, look, great having you on here. We're going to now switch to the top tip. So, Nandu, would you kindly introduce yourself? Tell us what you're doing now, a little bit about what you've done in the past, and leave us with your 2-minute practical top tip that you'd recommend. I think you've got a few thoughts of bits of advice which ties with the work you do. So over to you. Introduce yourself, please.
Nandu Govindankutty. I have 15 plus years senior leadership experience in financial services organizations like Barclays. I'm a 2-time tech founder. I ran a venture capital fund, and now I run a boutique leadership consulting business, helping C-suite and senior leaders to collectively overcome their blind spots. So talking about leadership tips, I'm not going to talk about skills and capabilities. But 5 things I'd like to remind people. Number 1 is focus on the right problem. You could easily be tempted to focus on a lot of things, and sometimes the biggest problem is not being able to focus on the right problem. So as people say, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. So zoom out and identify what is the right problem you want to solve. Number 2 is analysis paralysis. Don't go overboard. It's because many a time done is better than perfect. Because done is better than perfect because perfection is rarely done. Leaders do make mistakes, but never fall into the trap of an overkill of analysis paralysis. The third one is frugality, right? Countries like Russia and India and China, innovation happens out of social compulsion. Whereas the Western world, they're obsessed about things in the last few years which are either unnecessary, over-engineered, or incredibly expensive. A frugal mindset will truly help you to think outside the box and innovate. The fourth one is the communication chat GPT test. How confident are you that your team is exactly on the same page? As an exercise, pick up one of your most important emails, ask one of the bots to summarize, and if the finding is very different to what you had in mind, then there's a problem to solve. And the last one is the politician syndrome. Own up and take accountability rather than saying it was my predecessor. So I think these 5 things will truly help you to upgrade yourself from a good leader to a great one.
And make you an inspiring leader. Nandu, thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. I wish you every success with helping leaders to see their blind spots. It was a real pleasure swapping ideas and things with you. Good luck.
Thank you, Jonathan.